Alright, here we go. So I've got 10 grams of salt. It's actually closer to 11, but who's counting? 300 grams of water. Here's our bowl. Our scale is zeroed out there. We've got our flour here. We're going to go ahead and put in 400 grams. It's just shy of a pound. A pound is 454 grams. And the reason why we're doing everything in grams is a very important thing for you to make note of if you're used to measuring baking in volumes, in cups, what have you. The reason we do grams is because a cup of flour is not always going to be the same. If that flour is packed in, or if it's ground a little more finely, different brand, so on and so forth, there's going to be variation in the mass, in the amount of flour that you add to your loaf. However, when you do everything in grams, grams is a representation of mass, and therefore it will never change as long as your scale is properly calibrated. Of course, there's going to be people that are going to try and argue in the comment section saying that grams is going to read differently if you're on the moon. Well, guess what? For one, we're not on the moon. And for another, if you go onto the moon, your scale would have to be calibrated to measure a gram accurately. But anyway, I digress. There's 400 grams of flour. Throw our salt in there. It's always helpful to mix the flour and the salt when it's dry. If I were doing a solid yeast bread, I would mix the yeast in there dry so that it's a homogeneous distribution of the yeast and the salt and the flour before I add the water to it. But we want to just make sure that we don't have any part of this flour that's got massive concentration of salt before we add the water, because obviously it's going to be more challenging to mix things once water is added to it. Alrighty, I've already measured out the water, but we'll go ahead and, yeah, see, 411, I have 400 grams of flour and about 11 grams of salt in there. We'll go ahead and add our water. And 300. Close enough. This right here is our sourdough starter. In a mason jar, conveniently sized for the amount of starter that I typically use when I make sourdough bread. So the formula I use for sourdough bread is from I Love Cooking Ireland. It's a YouTube channel, phenomenal one, and his recipe calls for, and he bakes two loaves of bread at the same time. His recipe calls for 320 grams of sourdough starter, and when you mix up sourdough starter, you basically, when you purge and feed it, you purge out 2/3 of what you got in the jar, and then you add your equal parts of flour and water. So if the amount of starter left over in the jar is 100 grams, then you're going to have 100 grams of starter, add 100 grams of fresh water, and add 100 grams of fresh flour, so that everything is always in thirds. You've got 1/3 old starter, 1/3 new water and 1/3 new flour. So when I do my starter batch, because my recipe that I use calls for 320 grams, I make a jar with 480 grams of starter, so that when you take out 320 grams, you're left with 160 grams. You add 160 grams of water, 160 grams of flour, and 160 plus 160 plus 160 is 480, so you're right back to 480. Math is fun, you know? Alright, so our starter is mixed up. It smells great. I fed this last Tuesday, so it's still fine. We're going to tear our scale here. We are adding 200 grams of starter. And it's 86. You gotta be careful here, don't want to overshoot, because I'm not going to be able to take it out. We're at 166, 176, 183, getting there. Alright, 193, creeping up on it. That's got to be right there. Alrighty. Perfect. Alright. So, again, this is an experiment. It's an experiment because I have no idea how this is going to work. I've never done it before. I don't know anybody who has done it before. I have not done any research online, and I want to keep it that way. I want to kind of make this my own, if that makes sense to you. So when I'm doing traditional no-knead bread at this point in the game, you're let's make sure we're in focus here. You're really not mixing very much at all. And so we're going to just practice that here. We're going to do minimal mixing, and in theory, because we are working with, again, our units of hydration, the consistency, or the sogginess, or, you know, stickiness, etc. of this mixture would be exactly the same if I was doing no-knead bread. It's probably been several months since I've done no-knead bread, so I don't really remember, but this looks about right. Again, as I mentioned, it is high hydration dough, and high hydration is generally pretty challenging to work with because it gets all over your hands. But I think we'll be alright. This looks pretty good. And although it should be obvious, we are covering this with plastic wrap, not like putting it in the fridge and putting a cloth towel over it, etc., because we don't want that hydration, that 80% hydration figure, to change. And even if we leave this in the refrigerator, you still have evaporation in the refrigerator. It's much slower, but you still have evaporation. And of course, if we put this in the refrigerator, the activity of the yeast will be vastly reduced, and that 18 hours might no longer be adequate. So that's how we're going to leave it. I'm going to we'll do a little separate video on feeding our sourdough starter